Alara Voss had golden soot under her fingernails, a smudge of charcoal across her jaw, and the alpha king of the realm standing 6 feet away in her forge. She was holding a hammer. He was holding her gaze, and outside, through the warped glass of the workshop window, she could count no fewer than 12 royal guards arranged in a perimeter around a building that, until this morning, had never warranted more security than a rusted latch. The king filled her doorway like he'd been built specifically to block exits. Tall didn't cover it. He was architecturally large, the kind of broad-shouldered, sharp-jawed presence that made the low-beamed ceiling of her workshop look like a joke. Dark hair, cut short at the sides, longer on top where it fell slightly over a forehead that was currently creased in concentration. And his eyes, gray, the color of storm-washed iron, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to check if something behind her was on fire. Nothing was on fire. She would know. She worked with fire every day, and the forge was cold this morning because she hadn't been able to afford fuel since the gold was stolen. Alara Voss, he said. It wasn't a question. He said her name like he'd been carrying it in his mouth for hours, turning it over, tasting the shape of it. Like he'd ridden hard across a significant distance for the sole purpose of standing in this cramped, soot-blackened workshop and saying those 2 words to her face. That's me, Alara said, because apparently her survival instincts had taken the morning off. Can I help you? Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or the faintest ghost of amusement at being asked if he needed assistance by a woman who looked like she'd lost a fight with a chimney. You made this, he said, and held out his hand. Resting in his palm was the pendant. Her pendant. The one she'd spent 3 weeks crafting for the man who had smiled at her so warmly and then vanished in the night with every ounce of raw gold she owned. Alara stared at it. The filigree caught the pale morning light, throwing tiny golden patterns across the king's calloused fingers. She knew every curve of that metalwork because she'd shaped each one by hand, late into the night, pouring something into the gold that she couldn't name but could always feel. A warmth, a steadiness, a quality that made her work different from any other smith's. Yes, she said slowly. I made it. How? The king asked. Alara blinked. With a hammer, Your Majesty, and a forge, and some very uncooperative gold that took 3 separate meltings before it would hold the pattern. A guard near the door made a sound that might have been a strangled laugh, quickly smothered. The king didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way that suggested it was considering the option. Then his gaze sharpened again, locking onto her with renewed intensity. When I touched this pendant, he said, his voice dropping lower, something happened. Something that hasn't happened in 3 years. Alara waited, her hammer still raised in a grip that was slowly cutting off circulation to her fingers. The pain stopped, the king said quietly. The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the wind shifting the sign outside, Oren and Voss, fine metalwork, on its rusted hinges. What pain? Alara asked. The king's jaw tightened. He closed his fingers around the pendant and lowered his hand. Whatever door had cracked open in his expression sealed shut again, fast and total, like a portcullis dropping. You're coming with me, he said. Ilara's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. I'm sorry, what? To the capital, today. My guards will help you gather what you need. I can't just leave, Alara protested, gesturing around the workshop with the hammer in a way that made the nearest guard take a cautious step backward. I have commissions. I have a workshop. I have a... She scrambled for reasons. Any reasons. A cat. The cat can come, the king said, already turning toward the door. I don't actually have a cat. He paused, looked back at her over his shoulder, and for one suspended heartbeat, something warm and almost human flickered behind those storm-gray eyes. Then you have even less reason to stay, he said, and walked out. Alara stood in her empty forge, hammer still raised, soot on her face, and tried to process the fact that the most powerful alpha in the realm had just appeared in her life, said her name like it mattered, and informed her she was leaving. Today. Orin found her exactly like that 10 minutes later, frozen, wild-eyed, holding a hammer at nothing. "Girl," he said carefully, leaning on his cane in the doorway, "why is the king's personal guard offering to saddle our mule?" 24 hours earlier, the forge had been full of gold. Not a fortune. Alara had never possessed anything close to a fortune, but enough. 3 bars of raw stock, a pouch of filings she'd been saving for months, and 2 finished pieces waiting for their buyers. Enough to keep the workshop running through winter, to pay back the coal merchant, to stop Orin from pretending he wasn't worried about money when he clearly was. And then, Dashiell had walked in. He'd arrived on a Tuesday, which Alara would later decide was suspicious in itself because nothing good ever happened on a Tuesday. He was lean and sharp-featured, with fox-brown hair and a smile that arrived half a second before the rest of his face, like it had been sent ahead to scout. "I need something made," he'd said, dropping a pouch of silver onto her workbench with the casual confidence of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. "A pendant. Gold. Something extraordinary." "Extraordinary costs extra," Alara had replied, because Orin had taught her to negotiate before she'd learned to read. Dashiell's smile widened. "I wouldn't dream of paying for anything less." He'd been specific about the design, an intricate knotwork pattern with a center stone setting left empty, meant to hold something later. He wanted the metalwork itself to be the art, he said, no gemstones to distract from the gold. Alara worked on it for 3 weeks. She shouldn't have cared so much. It was a commission, same as any other. But the gold responded to her differently with this piece. It sang under her hands, warm and willing, shaping itself into patterns that felt less like design and more like language. She'd stay up past midnight working it, her fingers guided by something she couldn't explain, pouring a part of herself into the metal that she'd never consciously put there before. Dashiell visited twice during the process. He brought pastries from the bakery down the lane, complimented her technique with the specific vocabulary of someone who knew metalwork, and made her laugh, genuinely laugh, for the first time in months. On the night she finished the pendant, she wrapped it in soft cloth and left it on the workbench, planning to present it to him in the morning. She woke to an empty workshop. The pendant was gone. So was every bar of raw gold, the filing pouch, and the 2 finished commissions. The lockbox under the floorboard had been pried open with something thin and precise. A lockpick, probably, wielded by hands that knew exactly where to look. Dashiell had taken everything. Alara sat on the floor of the gutted workshop and stared at the empty lockbox and tried very hard not to cry. She failed. Orin found her there. And to his credit, he didn't say, "I told you so," even though his face communicated it with devastating clarity. "He knew where the lockbox was," Alara said miserably. "I never showed him." "You didn't have to," Orin replied gently. "A man like that reads a room the way you read metal. He saw it the first time he walked in." They reported the theft. The town guard took notes and made sympathetic noises, and everyone knew nothing would come of it because a traveling swindler with a head start was as good as gone. Alara spent the rest of the day cleaning the workshop and trying to calculate how long they could survive without the gold. The answer was not long. She later learned, much later, that Dashiell had sold the pendant to a merchant in the capital within hours, and that the merchant, recognizing the artistry, had offered it to the crown as a gift. The pendant had passed through 3 hands before it reached the king's. None of them had felt what he felt when he touched it. That night, she barely slept. She kept thinking about the pendant, the way the gold had felt alive under her fingers, the warmth it carried, the strange resonance. She'd made hundreds of pieces in her life. None of them had felt like that. She was still thinking about it when the sound of hooves woke her at dawn. Not one horse, many. The rhythmic, unified thunder of a column moving in formation. Alara went to the window and looked down into the street and felt her stomach drop through the floor. Royal banners. A full mounted escort. And at the center of the formation, a man on a black warhorse whose presence alone seemed to compress the air around him. The Alpha King. In Ashenmere. In her street. Dismounting in front of her forge. Orin, Alara called, her voice thin and reedy. Orin, I see him, Orin said from behind her, and she'd never heard the old man sound scared before, but he sounded something very close to it now. The knock that came was not a request for entry. It was a formality extended by someone who could have simply removed the door. The capital was overwhelming in ways Alara hadn't prepared for. The palace alone could have swallowed Ashenmere whole. A sprawling complex of stone and iron and stained glass that seemed designed to make anyone standing inside it feel the precise dimensions of their own insignificance. Alara felt them acutely as she followed Brennan, the king's beta, through corridors wide enough to march a battalion through. "Your forge has been prepared in the East Wing," Brennan said over his shoulder, his stride efficient and unhurried. He had the kind of face that disclosed nothing unless it chose to. Sharp cheekbones, dark eyes, a mouth that defaulted to a neutral line. "My forge?" Alara repeated. "The king requires your work. A forge has been provisioned accordingly." Alara wanted to ask approximately 900 questions, starting with why and ending with, "Can I go home?" But Brennan moved with the focused momentum of a man who did not entertain detours, so she saved her breath for keeping up. The forge they'd built for her was beautiful. It was also 3 times the size of Orin's workshop, stocked with tools she'd only ever seen in catalogs, and equipped with a ventilation system that actually worked. A crucible sat ready near the hearth, and beside it, arranged with careful precision, were 6 bars of the purest gold she had ever seen in her life. Alara touched one with trembling fingers. The metal hummed. "You'll begin today," Brennan said from the doorway. "The king will be present." "Present?" Alara turned sharply. "Present how? Watching?" "He has work of his own. He'll occupy the far end of the room." The beta paused. "Don't mind him. Don't mind the Alpha King, sitting in her forge. While she worked." "Right." Kale arrived an hour later without announcement. One moment the room held only Alara and the nervous energy of a woman trying to light a forge with shaking hands. The next, the air shifted, thickened somehow, and she turned to find him settling into a heavy oak chair that had been positioned near the window at the room's far end. He carried a stack of reports. He did not look at her. He simply sat, opened the first document, and began to read. Alara watched him for a long, bewildered moment. Then she turned back to the forge and got to work. The first hour was excruciating. She was hyper-aware of him. Every page he turned, every shift in his posture, the way the light from the window caught the hard line of his jaw. Her hands fumbled with tongs she'd been using since she was 12. She dropped a file. She measured the same piece of stock 3 times. But then the gold heated, and the metal started to respond, and the familiar rhythm of her craft took over. Hammer strikes fell into cadence. The gold softened, shaped, began to speak to her in the wordless language she'd known since childhood. The world narrowed to heat and metal, and the precise meditative dance of creation. She forgot about the king. It wasn't until she paused to wipe sweat from her forehead that she noticed the silence. Not absence of sound. The forge crackled, the bellows wheezed, but a different quality of silence. The kind that meant someone was watching. Kale's reports lay untouched in his lap. His gray eyes were fixed on her, and the expression on his face was one she couldn't parse. Something raw, something almost reverent, something that made her breath snag in her throat. But it wasn't the look that stopped her. It was his body. the rigid, locked-down tension she'd seen in every line of him since the moment they'd met. The clenched jaw, the white-knuckled grip, the faint tremor beneath his skin, was gone. His shoulders had dropped. His hands were open and loose against the chair arms. His breathing was slow, deep, even. He looked like a man who had been carrying a boulder and someone had, without warning, taken it from him. "Your Majesty?" Ilara said carefully. "Are you all right?" The question seemed to startle him. He blinked, looked down at his hands, and something complicated moved across his face. "Continue working," he said quietly. "Please." So she did. And as the afternoon stretched on, she watched the transformation deepen. The longer she worked the gold, the more the pain seemed to drain from him. By the time the light began to fade, he had slipped into something close to sleep, not quite unconscious, but drifting, his head tilted back against the chair, his chest rising and falling with the deep rhythm of genuine rest. Ilara set down her hammer and stood very still, watching him breathe. 3 years, the king had told her. 3 years of constant, unrelenting pain. And here, in a forge, surrounded by the sound of her work and the scent of heated gold, the king had found quiet. She didn't understand why, but she understood what it meant. She moved carefully to the work table, poured water from the pitcher without clinking the cup, and sat down to wait. She would not wake him. Whatever was happening, whatever impossible alchemy existed between her craft and his suffering, she would sit here in silence for as long as he needed. Brennan appeared in the doorway an hour later. He took one look at the king, asleep, genuinely asleep, in a forge belonging to a woman he'd met yesterday, and went very still. His gaze moved to Ilara. She expected questions. She expected suspicion. Instead, the beta looked at her with something she could only describe as desperate, fragile hope. "Same time tomorrow," he said softly, and left without another word. That night, alone in the small chamber they'd given her, Ilara lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what she'd witnessed. The pendant had stopped his pain. Her work eased his suffering. Proximity to her forge put him to sleep. What was she to this king? A remedy? A tool? A peculiar accident of biology? And why, when he'd looked at her across the forge with that unguarded expression, had something deep inside her chest shifted and refused to shift back? A routine formed. Each morning, Ilara arrived at the forge before dawn. Each afternoon, the king arrived without announcement and settled into his chair. She worked. He rested. They didn't speak. It lasted 4 days before Ilara broke. "You don't have to pretend to read those," she said on the 5th morning, nodding toward the reports in his lap. 3 of them were upside down. Kyle looked at the documents, then at her, then back at the documents. He turned them right side up without comment, and Ilara bit her cheek to keep from smiling. On the 6th day, she arrived to find the forge had been upgraded overnight. New bellows, the kind with the double-chamber mechanism she'd been dreaming about for years, a precision scale she couldn't have afforded in 3 lifetimes, and a cushioned stool positioned at her primary workstation, replacing the wooden slab she'd been perching on. "Who authorized this?" she asked Brennan. The beta's expression was magnificently blank. "The palace maintains its facilities. The palace installed a stool with embroidered cushioning at my specific workstation." "Standard issue," Brennan said, and walked away. That afternoon, Ilara sat on her suspiciously comfortable new stool and glanced at the king. "Thank you for the bellows," she said. Cale didn't look up from his report. "I don't know what you're referring to." "And the scale." "The facilities team." "And the stool, Your Majesty." She patted the cushion. "Which is genuinely the most comfortable thing I've ever sat on. So if this is standard issue, I have serious questions about how the rest of the palace lives." The tips of his ears went red. Ilara felt something warm bloom in her chest, and she turned back to her work before he could see her grinning. The gestures continued, always denied, always transparently his doing. A basket of fresh bread appeared at her workstation every morning. The kitchens overproduce, Brennan explained with a straight face. A wool-lined cloak materialized on the hook by the forge door the day the weather turned cold. Lost and found, the beta offered, despite the cloak being brand new and exactly her size. A set of specialized engraving tools arrived in a velvet-lined case. These Kale didn't even attempt to explain, and Ilara didn't ask, because she was too busy trying not to cry at the craftsmanship. He started staying longer. The afternoons bled into evenings. She'd look up from her work and find the light gone amber, the forge burning low, and the king still in his chair. Not sleeping now, but watching her with an unguarded attention that made her pulse quicken. And she started talking. Not about anything important at first. About the gold work, the techniques she was experimenting with, the time she'd accidentally fused a ring to her workbench and had to chisel it free, while Oren laughed so hard he pulled a muscle. Kyle listened. She knew, because he remembered. "The fused ring," he said one evening, breaking a silence that had lasted 20 minutes. "Did the customer ever find out?" Ilara nearly dropped her tongs. He'd been paying attention. Days ago, buried in a rambling story she'd assumed he was ignoring, and he'd stored the detail away and retrieved it now, unprompted, like it mattered. "No," she said, recovering. "I reshaped it. You couldn't even tell." "Could you tell?" "Of course I could tell. I'm the one who made it." He studied her face. "You hold yourself to an impossible standard," says the man who governs an entire kingdom and apparently also monitors the bread output of his kitchens on a daily basis. The sound he made was almost, a laugh. Low, brief, caught behind his teeth before it could fully escape. But it changed his entire face. The hard lines softened. The iron-gray eyes warmed. For one instant he looked like a man instead of a monument. Ilara's breath caught. She wanted to hear that sound again, wanted to be the reason for it. That realization frightened her more than anything had in years. 2 weeks in, it happened. She was adjusting the clasp on a finished bracelet, a delicate piece with interlocking gold leaves, and reached across the workbench to hand it to him. Their fingers brushed. The forge disappeared. Fire. Everywhere. Stone walls collapsing inward, beams cracking overhead, and a sound. A roar of heat and destruction so total it swallowed everything, voices, screams, her own heartbeat. She couldn't see through the smoke. She couldn't breathe. The heat pressed against her skin like hands, and she opened her mouth to scream. Ilara gasped back into the present, the bracelet clattering to the floor. She was gripping the edge of the workbench, her chest heaving, her skin damp with a sweat that had nothing to do with the forge. Kyle was on his feet. His chair had scraped backward across the stone. And his face. His face was a study in controlled terror, the expression of a man who knew exactly what she'd just seen and was bracing for the fallout. "What was that?" Ilara breathed. He didn't answer. His hands were clenched at his sides, his knuckles bone white, and for the first time since she'd known him, the pain that lived beneath his skin was visible on the surface, raw, exposed, bleeding through every crack in his composure. "Kale," she whispered, and watched him flinch at his own name. He turned and left the forge without a word. The door didn't slam. It closed with a soft, deliberate click that was somehow worse than any slam could have been. Ilara stood alone in the amber light, the fallen bracelet at her feet, fire still echoing behind her eyes, and understood for the first time that the king's pain wasn't just physical. It was a memory, and it was destroying him from the inside out. The burn on his palm shouldn't have mattered. Kale had taken worse in the sparring ring without flinching. She'd watched him disarm 3 guards that morning with a wrist that was already bruised. But when Alara saw the raw, blistered skin where molten slag had caught him, something in her chest lurched sideways and refused to right itself. "Sit," she said, pulling a stool toward her workbench. The king looked at the stool like it had personally insulted him. "It's a surface burn." "Sit," Alara repeated, already reaching for the salve she kept near the quenching trough. She'd started keeping it there 3 weeks ago, around the same time she'd noticed Cale had a habit of hovering too close to the forge when she worked. He never admitted it, but his pain eased when the gold was molten, when the heat of her craft filled the air, and so he drifted closer than was safe for a man who wasn't a smith. Kyle sat. The stool groaned under him. His knees came up almost comically high, and Alara had to press her lips together to keep from smiling because the most feared alpha in the realm looked like a grown man perched on a child's chair. "Give me your hand," she said. He extended it slowly, palm up, and she cradled it in both of hers. His fingers were rough, calloused from years of sword work, and impossibly warm. She could feel the curse humming through him, a low, persistent vibration, like a fever that never broke. "This will sting," she warned, unscrewing the salve. "I've been stabbed, Alara." "And I'm sure you were very brave about it." She dabbed the salve across the burn and felt him tense. Not from pain, she realized, from the contact, her fingertips against his palm, the closeness. She could smell him, cedar and iron and something deeper. Something that made her wolf press forward beneath her skin with an urgency that frightened her. She was smoothing the salve along the edge of the blister when it hit. Not a flash this time. Not the brief, violent glimpse she'd gotten before. This was total immersion. The workshop vanished, the light changed, and suddenly she was standing in a place that reeked of smoke and terror. Stone walls rose around her, blackened and crumbling. Fire crawled across wooden beams overhead, sending showers of sparks cascading down into the darkness. The heat was unbearable, pressing against her skin from every direction, and through the roar of flames she could hear screaming. Not battle cries, not soldiers, women, children. Voices breaking apart with fear and agony and desperate, clawing hope that someone would come. Alara tried to move, tried to turn toward the sound, but her body wasn't her own here. She was a passenger, locked inside a memory that didn't belong to her. She saw him then. Cale, younger, his face streaked with ash and blood. He stood outside the keep walls, surrounded by soldiers, and he was shouting orders she couldn't quite hear over the inferno. His expression wasn't fury. It wasn't cold command. It was horror. Raw, unprocessed horror, the look of a man watching something unfold that he couldn't undo. The keep collapsed inward with a sound like the world breaking. A wall of heat and debris blasted outward, and through the dust a soldier stumbled free carrying something. Someone. Small, limp, burns covering skin that should have been untouched by any of this. A child. Maybe 5 years old. Eyes open but seeing nothing. The soldier laid the body at Cale's feet, and Alara watched the king fall to his knees. Watched his hands hover over the child, shaking, afraid to touch. Watched his mouth form a word she couldn't hear but understood anyway. No. The vision shattered. Alara gasped, wrenching backwards so violently she knocked the salve off the workbench. It hit the stone floor and cracked, sending pale ointment spreading across the flagstones. She was back. The forge, the heat, the warm copper glow of the hearth. And Cale was staring at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not surprise, but a bone-deep dread, the look of a man whose worst secret had just been dragged into the light. "What did you see?" His voice was barely a whisper. Ilara's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs to steady herself, but she could still smell the smoke, could still hear the screaming echoing inside her skull like it had taken up permanent residence. The keep, she managed. The fire. There were people inside. Something behind his eyes went dark. Kale. She used his name without thinking, without the title, and watched him flinch like she'd struck him. There was a child. He stood abruptly, the stool scraping backward across the stone. The warmth that had been building between them, weeks of quiet mornings and stolen glances and small unspoken kindnesses, evaporated like water on hot iron. "That conversation is not yours to have," he said. His voice had gone flat, controlled, every syllable locked down tight. "But I saw it. I felt—" "You felt nothing." He was already moving toward the door, his burned hand forgotten, his walls slamming back into place so fast she could almost hear them. "You're here to forge gold, Alara. That is the extent of your role." The words landed like a backhand. Her chest tightened, and something hot and stinging rose behind her eyes. "Kale." "Your Majesty," he corrected without turning around. The door closed behind him with a finality that had nothing to do with volume. No slam, no force, just the sound of a man sealing himself away from the one person who had gotten too close. Alara stood alone in the forge, the broken salve jar at her feet, the ghost of smoke still clinging to her lungs, and felt the distance between them open like a wound. She had seen what haunted him, and instead of letting her carry it with him, he had shut her out entirely. He didn't come to the forge the next day. Or the day after. On the third morning, Brennan appeared in the doorway with a face carved from stone and told her the king had arranged an escort to return her to Ashenmere. Her services were no longer required. No explanation, no farewell. Just a horse, 2 guards, and the road home. 3 days after that, Alara stopped being able to hold her hammer steady. It started small. A tremor in her fingers when she reached for her tongs. A slight unsteadiness when she lifted the crucible. She blamed fatigue at first, then the cold. The forge in Oren's workshop didn't burn as hot as the royal one, and the autumn chill had teeth this year. But by the second day, the tremor had spread to her arms, and by the third morning, she woke with her sheets soaked through and a headache so savage it turned the gray light into knives. "You look terrible," Oren said from the doorway, his lined face creased with concern. He was leaning on his cane, the one he pretended he didn't need, and watching her with the sharp assessment of a man who had raised her since she was small enough to sleep in a basket beside his anvil. "Thank you," Alara muttered, pressing the heels of her hands against her eyes. "When did you last eat?" She tried to remember and couldn't. The thought of food made her stomach turn sideways. Everything made her stomach turn sideways. The sounds were too loud, the light was too bright, and beneath it all there was a hollow, aching pull in her chest that pointed northeast, toward the capital, toward him, like a compass needle she couldn't demagnetize. "I'm fine," she lied. "You're gray," Oren corrected. "Literally. Your skin has gone gray, Alara." She ignored him and dragged herself to the forge because the alternative was lying in bed, feeling the pull get worse, and at least working gave her hands something to do besides reach for someone who wasn't there. The gold wouldn't cooperate. It never did anymore, not since she'd left the palace. The metal felt dead under her hands. No warmth, no resonance, none of the singing quality it used to carry when she shaped it. She heated it, hammered it, and it just sat there, inert and wrong, like it was mourning the same absence she was. She made it 2 hours before her vision started going white at the edges. "Alara?" Oren's voice came from somewhere far away. She was gripping the edge of the workbench, her fingers bloodless and aching, trying to keep the room from spinning. The pull in her chest had become a fist, squeezing, and her wolf was clawing at her insides with a desperation that bordered on feral. "I need to sit down," she said. but her legs buckled before she could reach the chair, and the stone floor rushed up to meet her. She didn't feel the impact. Everything just went soft and dark and mercifully quiet. When she opened her eyes, she was in her bed, and Brennan was standing at the foot of it. The king's beta looked exactly as she remembered, composed, unreadable, slightly too perceptive for comfort. Except that his jaw was tight in a way she'd never seen before, and his hands were clasped behind his back with the rigid discipline of a man restraining himself from punching something. "How long?" Alara croaked. "You've been unconscious for 6 hours," Brennan said. "Your guardian sent word to the palace." Oren stood near the window, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "I sent word because you collapsed on my forge floor, and I couldn't wake you. And because the king's man here told me to report any changes in your condition when he shipped you back like damaged goods." "I wasn't shipped. You were removed from the palace with an armed escort and no explanation," Oren cut in. "Forgive me for interpreting the situation." Alara looked at Brennan. The beta's expression hadn't shifted, but something in his eyes cracked, just slightly, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely afraid. "I need to tell you something," Brennan said, "and I need you to listen without interrupting, because the king would have my head if he knew I was here." Alara's heart lurched. "The vision you had," Brennan continued. "The fire, the keep. You saw Thornwall." The name meant nothing to her, and everything at once. 3 years ago, a warlord named Soren Blacktide held the eastern borderlands through terror. Raids, abductions, brutality. The villages near the Thornwall fortress were being bled dry. The king marched to end it. Brennan paused, and the careful composure in his voice thinned. Blacktide drove civilians into the keep, packed them inside. Women, children, elderly, and positioned his fighters on the walls. He told the king that any assault on the fortress would mean their deaths. Alara felt sick. He used them as shields. The king tried to wait him out, sent negotiators, offered amnesty, anything. Brennan's jaw tightened. Blacktide began executing hostages, one every hour, displaying them on the walls as a warning. He was going to kill them all regardless. The room felt airless. The king ordered fire on the east wall, a targeted breach, designed to create an escape route for the civilians inside. But Blacktide had barricaded the interior corridors. The fire spread faster than anyone anticipated. Brennan stopped, swallowed. They saved most of them. Most. Not all. The child. The burned, still body laid at Kale's feet. 17 civilians died in the fire, Brennan said quietly. The king has carried every name since. Alara stared at the ceiling, tears sliding sideways into her hair. He hadn't wanted those deaths. He'd tried to save them and failed, and the failure had been consuming him ever since. "The curse," she whispered. "Blacktide's witch?" "His mother, Veda." Brennan nodded. She cursed him as they pulled her from the rubble, told him the fire would live inside him forever, that he would burn the way they burned, every moment, until it consumed him. Alara closed her eyes, the way his hands never fully stilled, even when he sat reading in his chair. The way his jaw locked when the pain crested, teeth grinding against something no one else could see. The afternoons she'd watched him grip the arms of his chair until the wood groaned, refusing to show weakness in front of a woman he barely knew. "He's dying," she said. Not a question. Brennan was quiet for a long moment. "The healers estimate 4 months. Perhaps less. The curse accelerates. Each week worse than the last. His wolf is deteriorating. He can barely hold a partial shift without the pain driving him to his knees." 4 months. The number landed like a stone in still water, sending cracks radiating outward through everything she thought she understood. "And me?" Alara asked, her voice small. "What's happening to me?" Brennan looked at Oren. Oren looked at the floor. "The bond," Brennan said carefully. You share a forming mate bond with the king. It's incomplete, unclaimed, unacknowledged, but it's there, and it's been strengthening since the day you met. Alara's lungs seized. She'd known. Somewhere deep, in the marrow of her bones, she'd known. An incomplete bond under this kind of strain, the distance, the curse, the resistance. It tears at both ends, Brennan continued. His deterioration will pull you down with him, if the curse takes him. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. You'll die too, Oren said from the window, his voice rough and broken. That's what he's telling you, girl. If that king dies, the bond will drag you into the ground beside him. The silence that followed was absolute. Alara lay in her narrow bed in her tiny room above the forge where she'd grown up, and felt the future she'd imagined, small, quiet, safe, dissolve like ash in rain. She could leave, sever the bond before it solidified, cut herself free, survive. Or she could go back, finish what had already started, save him or die trying. How long do I have? She asked. Brennan studied her face for a long moment. Before the bond becomes irreversible? Weeks? Maybe less. Alara sat up slowly, ignoring the way the room tilted and her vision swam. She looked at Oren, at the man who had fed her and taught her and loved her when no one else in the world had wanted to. I have to go back, she said. Oren's face crumpled, then hardened, then crumpled again. I know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know you do. The ride back to the capital took 2 days. Alara spent most of it hunched over the saddle, gripping the horse's mane with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, her body running on something that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with stubbornness. Brennan had offered an escort. She'd refused. If Cale learned she was coming, he'd find a way to stop her, and she was done being stopped. The palace gates opened without resistance. Brennan's doing, she suspected, the beta working behind his king's back with the quiet efficiency of a man who had decided that loyalty sometimes meant disobedience. Brennan had left directions folded into the saddle pack. A hand-drawn map of the upper corridors, unsigned, with a single room marked in ink. Alara followed it through passages she'd never walked, the torches burning lower than she remembered from the rest of the palace, as though this wing was dimming in sympathy with its king. She didn't knock. She pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped inside. The room was dark except for the dying glow of a fire that no one had bothered to feed. The air smelled of iron and something acrid. Burned flesh, she realized with a lurch. His curse, manifesting physically now, no longer content to simmer beneath the surface. Cale stood by the window, his back to her, one hand braced against the stone frame. Even from across the room she could see the tension coiled through his body, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his fingers dug into the stone like he was trying to anchor himself to something solid. The guards will be disciplined for letting you in, he said without turning around. They answered to Brennan. Then Brennan will be disciplined. Then you'll lose the only person in this palace willing to tell you when you're being an idiot, Alara replied, her voice steadier than she felt. He turned, and Alara's breath left her body. He looked like death, not figuratively, literally. The hollows beneath his eyes had deepened into bruises. His skin, normally warm brown, had taken on an ashen undertone that made him look carved from smoke. He'd lost weight, the sharp angles of his face now cutting rather than commanding, and when his gaze found hers, the gray of his eyes burned too bright, almost feverish. You can't be here, he said. You can't stop me. Alara. Her name came out fractured, and she watched his control crack along the fault lines. I am trying to keep you alive. By dying alone? She stepped forward, and he stepped back. The king of the realm, retreating from a goldsmith half his size. By sending me away so I can feel you burning through the bond every night and know that you won't let anyone help? The bond will fade if we stay apart long enough. No, it won't. Another step forward. He hit the wall beside the window, and she saw his hands clench at his sides, saw the veins in his forearms stand rigid beneath the skin. Brennan told me, 4 months, that's what the healers give you. Something dangerous flickered across his face. Brennan had no right. Brennan loves you, you impossible man. So does half your court, not that you'd notice, because you're too busy trying to carry everything alone. You don't understand what I've done. The words ripped out of him, ragged and raw. Thornwall, the fire, 17 people, Ilara. I gave the order. I lit the match. A child died in my soldier's arms because I wasn't fast enough, wasn't clever enough to find another way. I know, Ilara said, and her voice broke on the second word. I saw it. I felt it. I know what happened, and I know what it cost you. And I know you've been paying for it every single day since. She was close enough now to touch him, close enough to feel the heat radiating off his skin. Unnatural. Wrong. The curse burning through him like a slow-motion immolation. You tried to save them, she whispered. You tried everything, and some of them still died. And that is the worst thing that has ever happened to you. But punishing yourself won't bring them back. Dying won't settle the debt. All it will do is take you away from everyone who needs you to stay. His breathing was ragged, shallow, his chest heaving. She could see the war happening behind his eyes, the desperate need to push her away versus the equally desperate need to pull her close. I smell you everywhere, he said suddenly, the confession torn from him like a bandage from a wound. Since the day you left, in the forge, in the corridors, on the gold you touched. I dream about your hands and wake up reaching for someone who isn't there, and the absence is worse than the burning, Ilara. It's worse than the curse. Her eyes filled. Then stop reaching into empty space, she said, and reach for me. He broke. His hands came up to her face, cradling her jaw, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with a reverence that made her chest ache. He pressed his forehead against hers, and she felt him shaking. The great, terrifying Alpha King, shaking like a man who had been cold for 3 years and finally found warmth. If I let you stay, he said against her mouth, the curse could take you too. You understand that. You could burn with me. Ilara looked up at him, at the fear carved into every line of his face, at the hope he was trying so hard to smother. Then we burn together, she said. But I don't think we will. He kissed her. Not gently. There was nothing gentle left in either of them. His mouth found hers with a desperation that tasted like grief and relief, and 3 years of loneliness cracking open all at once. She kissed him back with equal force, her fingers twisting into his shirt, pulling him closer, needing more contact, needing the bond to stop aching and start breathing. She felt it through the bond. The moment she pressed her hand flat against his chest, the constant searing agony that had been his companion for 3 years dimmed. Not gone, but quiet, bearable, like plunging a red-hot blade into cool water. Ilara, he breathed, and her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer. What followed was everything words couldn't hold. When the bond between them finally sealed, something ancient and instinctive clicking into place between their wolves, the world went golden and still and infinite. She felt him pour into her through the bond, every memory, every scar, every sleepless night spent pacing alone in the dark. And she gave him everything back. Every year of being unclaimed, every quiet ache of belonging to no one, every morning spent wondering if she would ever matter enough to be kept. They held each other afterward, his arms wrapped around her, his face buried in her hair. She could feel his heartbeat against her, steady now, calm, the frantic burning reduced to embers. "Stay," he murmured into the back of her neck. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. He fell asleep holding her, truly deeply asleep. No pain, no restlessness, no tremor beneath his skin. Just the warm, heavy weight of a man at peace for the first time in years. Alara smiled against his arm and closed her eyes, letting the golden hum of the bond carry her down into sleep. She dreamed of fire, not the gentle glow of her forge, not the warm amber of candlelight. This was the fire from his memory, ravenous, screaming, consuming everything it touched. And it was everywhere. Alara opened her eyes inside the burning keep, smoke filling her lungs, heat pressing against her skin, and realized with ice-cold certainty that the curse hadn't been weakened by the bond. It had been waiting for her. The keep materialized around her in fragments, stone walls blackening and splitting, wooden beams groaning overhead, fire licking up from below like something alive and starving. Smoke churned through corridors she didn't recognize, thick and acrid, burning her throat with every breath. "Kale!" Ilara shouted, but the roar of the fire swallowed his name. She moved forward because standing still felt like dying. The heat pressed against her from every direction, and through the bond she could feel him, not far, somewhere ahead, his presence a bright point of agony in the inferno. She found him in the central hall. The ceiling was gone, consumed, and fire rained down through the open sky like a punishment from the heavens. Kale knelt in the center of the room, his head bowed, his hands flat against the scorched stone floor. He wasn't burning. The fire moved around him like water around a stone. But the suffering radiating through the bond was so intense it nearly brought Ilara to her knees. "Kale, we need to go." She reached for his shoulder. "You shouldn't be here." His voice came out scraped raw, hollowed. "The curse pulled you in. I knew it would. I knew the bond would. I don't care. I'm here. Look at me." He didn't. His eyes were fixed on the far wall, where the fire was doing something wrong, parting, dimming, forming a corridor of fading light. And through it, figures were emerging. Alara's breath stopped. They came slowly, one by one, stepping through the fire as though it couldn't touch them. Men and women and... Her throat tightened. Children. 17 of them. Their skin was marked with burns that would never heal, their eyes carrying an ancient weariness that went beyond death into something permanent and unforgiving. The ghosts of Thornwall. They arranged themselves in a silent half-circle around the kneeling king, and Alara understood with horrible clarity that this was what happened every time the curse dragged him under. Every night for 3 years, they had come for him. Not to attack, not to torment in any physical sense, just to stand there, to be seen, to make him look at what he'd done. A woman stepped forward, middle-aged, kind-faced even in death, a wound across her collarbone where a falling beam had caught her. She carried a child on her hip, a boy, no older than 5, his small body marked with the unmistakable patterns of fire damage. "Marin," Kale whispered. "And her son, Tobin." He knew their names. All 17. Alara felt it through the bond. Each name carved into him like a scar, carried every waking moment, recited in the dark during the years when sleep meant returning here. Marin spoke. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, which made the words so much worse. "You gave the order," she said. "You knew we were inside." "I didn't," Kyle's voice broke. "The corridors were barricaded. We couldn't reach you. I thought the breach would..." "You thought." The ghost's tone carried no malice, only a quiet, devastating fact. "And we burned." Alara watched the words hit him through the bond and felt his guilt rise like a tide, black and total and all-consuming. 3 years of believing he deserved this, 3 years of returning to this room and agreeing with the dead because some part of him, the part that remembered a child's body laid at his feet, truly believed no punishment could equal what he'd done. The curse fed on that belief. She could feel its mechanics now through the bond, a parasitic magic that didn't create guilt, but amplified what was already there, turning a wound into a furnace, ensuring it never cooled, never scarred over, never began to heal. He tried to save you, Alara said, stepping forward. The ghosts turned to look at her. 17 pairs of eyes, patient and unblinking. He sent negotiators. He offered amnesty. He waited while Black Tide murdered hostages one by one and threw their bodies from the walls. Her voice shook, but she held it together. He ordered the breach to create an escape route, and the fire spread faster than anyone could have predicted. And yes, 17 people died, and it was terrible, and it was wrong, and nothing will ever make it right. She knelt beside Kale and took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. His eyes were raw, red-rimmed, stripped of every defense. But you didn't choose to kill them, she said, her voice breaking. You chose to try to save them, and you failed. And that failure has been eating you alive for 3 years because you are the kind of man who carries other people's pain until it destroys him. The fire around them flickered. I know something about being destroyed by a story you tell yourself, Alara continued, tears sliding down her face. I spent my whole life believing I wasn't enough, that my parents left me on a forged doorstep because something in me was broken, defective, not worth keeping. And every time someone was kind to me, I waited for them to leave too, because that's what the story said would happen. She pressed her forehead against his, feeling his shaking breath against her skin. But the story was wrong, Kale. My parents' choice says nothing about my worth, and what happened at Thornwall says nothing about yours. You are not the worst thing that ever happened to you. The fire guttered, the ghosts wavered. You can't undo what happened, Ilara whispered, but you can stop letting it consume you. You can grieve them and still choose to live. Those aren't opposites. She turned to the ghosts, to Marin, to little Tobin on her hip, to all 17 faces watching from the firelight. He remembers you, Ilara said to them, her voice thick. Every name, every face. He has never forgotten. But he deserves to survive the remembering, and so do you. You deserve to rest. For a long moment, nothing happened. The fire held. The ghost stood motionless. Then Kale's hand came up and covered hers where it rested against his cheek. I'm sorry, he said to them. Not the tortured, broken apology of a man seeking absolution, but something quieter, simpler. The apology of a man who was, finally, ready to set the weight down. I'm sorry I couldn't reach you in time. I'm sorry the fire spread. I'm sorry for every moment of pain. I will carry you with me, but I cannot live here anymore. Marin looked at him for a long moment. Then her gaze shifted to Alara, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition. Understanding. The acknowledgement of one woman looking at another and seeing someone who would hold this man together when the dead no longer could. Tobin reached out one small hand toward the king. Kale took it, his fingers dwarfing the child's, and held on. Then the boy smiled. Small, fleeting, heartbreaking. The ghosts dissolved. Not violently, not dramatically. They simply came apart, like embers lifting from a dying fire, drifting upward into the smoke-darkened sky. One by one, they let go. Marin was last. She looked at Kyle, then at Alara, and closed her eyes. The fire went out. Not gradually. All at once, like a held breath finally released. The heat vanished. The smoke cleared. The ruined keep faded. Stone walls dissolving into nothing, until all that remained was darkness and silence, and the two of them kneeling on ground that was no longer there. Kale fell forward into her arms, She caught him, held him, felt 3 years of grief and guilt pour out of him in shuddering, wrecking waves. He cried the way men cry who have not allowed themselves to in years, silently, violently, his entire body shaking with the force of it. "I've got you," Alara whispered, her hands in his hair, her tears soaking into his shirt. "I've got you. You're done. It's over." She held him until the shaking stopped, until the darkness around them softened, until the world reassembled itself into warmth and firelight and tangled sheets. They woke together, in his bed, in the amber glow of a fire that had burned down to its final embers. Ilara blinked, disoriented, her heart still racing, her face still damp. Kale was awake beside her, looking at her with an expression she had never seen on anyone's face in her entire life. Wonder, gratitude, love so vast and unguarded it made him look almost young. He touched her cheek with careful fingers, tracing the track of a tear that hadn't dried yet. "Thank you," he breathed. Ilara smiled at him, watery and raw and radiant. "You're welcome," she whispered. "Now please, for the love of everything, go back to sleep." He laughed, a real laugh, broken and wet and beautiful, and pulled her against his chest and closed his eyes. He slept until morning. The curse didn't shatter like glass. It receded like a tide, slowly, unevenly, leaving debris behind that took months to clear. Kale still woke some nights with his skin hot and his hands clenched. The memories didn't vanish just because he'd chosen to stop drowning in them. Grief was not a door you walked through once and left behind. It was a landscape you lived in, and the terrain changed slowly. But Ilara was there. Every night, every morning, her weight beside him in the dark, her hand finding his before he fully surfaced from whatever dream had followed him up. She didn't try to fix it. She didn't offer platitudes or force optimism. She just stayed. "You talked in your sleep," she told him one morning, tracing idle patterns on his chest. "What did I say?" "You asked someone to pass the salt." He stared at her. "That doesn't sound like a nightmare." "It wasn't. You're healing." She grinned. "Your subconscious has moved on to dinner logistics." Their mating sent the court into a slow, dignified frenzy. A foundling goldsmith with no family name and soot permanently embedded in her nail beds was not what the nobility had envisioned for their king. The whispers followed Ilara through every corridor, every banquet, every public appearance where she stood beside him in finery she still didn't feel she'd earned. But Kale's hand never wavered in hers. His voice never faltered when he introduced her, and when a particularly bold courtier suggested within earshot that the king might reconsider his choice, Kale had looked at the man with the flat, patient expression of an apex predator deciding whether something was worth the effort of killing. The courtier reconsidered his comment instead. "They'll adjust," Kyle murmured against her temple that night, holding her in the fire-lit dark of their chambers. "And if they don't? Then they can take it up with their king, who happens to be entirely, irrevocably, and somewhat embarrassingly devoted to his mate." Ilara laughed against his chest, and the sound echoed off the stone walls, warm, bright, alive. Months later, on a morning so ordinary it felt revolutionary, Ilara woke to pale light filtering through the curtains. Kale was still asleep beside her, his face slack and peaceful, one arm draped across her waist with the casual possessiveness of a man who had stopped being afraid of reaching for what he wanted. No nightmares, no fire, no tremor beneath his skin. She studied him in the quiet, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the way sleep softened the hard architecture of his face into something almost gentle. The bond hummed between them, warm and golden and unbreakable, connecting her to a man she'd never expected and couldn't imagine existing without. Ilara settled back against his shoulder, closed her eyes, and let the morning hold them both. Outside the window, the forge smoke rose in a thin, steady line against the sky.